Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Fort Vancouver Regional Library's 5th annual Words and Pictures. This is our second year doing it online. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Jamie. I'm the experiential learning librarian for Fort Vancouver Regional Libraries. And our moderator today is Kristen Peterson, and our speaker is author Curtis Chen. Thank you both for being here. And I will turn it over to Christy.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad you're here. I'm super excited that Curtis is going to speak for us. This is something that he's done, I think, for some other places, and I asked him if he would be willing to share it here too, because I think query letters are something that anybody who's writing eventually comes up against and has to figure out how to thread the needle of saying what they want to say, but not saying too much. And so I think it's just helpful to have someone's help out with that. Curtis he's got one of his books in the corner there. He's the author of Waypoint Kangaroo, and I have the other one back here. It's Waypoint Kangaroo 2. Oh, there it is. And he's also written just lots and lots of articles and stories and short stories. He's got a short story appearing in Forced Avenue's Dispatches from Anares. I think I pronounced that correctly. That's coming out here in the next few weeks. And he's also involved with the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America chapter in the area. So he's just been around and helped a lot of people, and I'm really excited that he is able to speak to us today. So go ahead, Curtis.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Jamie, and to all the library folks for helping out and putting on this event. This is really cool. Glad to see so many people here. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into the presentation, and we should have some time for questions at the end. This is going until 2:15, I believe. And yeah, everything will become clear. Hopefully. Okay, here we go. All right. Can everyone see that title card there? Yes? No?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. So this is Query Letters and Other Author Nightmares. I will say that I think Christy came up with that title when she asked me to present on this topic, and it may not be as much of a nightmare as you might think. It is a little daunting because I will say as a preface that writing a query letter or doing any kind of a pitch session, which you may do if you're at a conference or if you're talking to an agent, is very different than actually writing the novel, and putting that story together. It's a more salesy thing. It's definitely part of the business of publishing and not the art of it. But there is some art to it in that you need to know what your story is and know what's most interesting about it, so you can introduce it to someone and get them to want to know more about it. And I'll expand on those. I've given this presentation, as Christy mentioned before, in a few different forms. It always changes a little bit depending on who I anticipate is going to be in the audience. So I don't know where everyone is here in their project, but if you have a more specific question at the end, feel free to ask that. So I'm just going to go through the basics here. First, who am I? I'm Curtis Chen. Hi. I write mostly science fiction and fantasy. So I'm the author of the Kangaroo novels. You can see the first two there. And I've been working on a serial fiction for the last couple of years. 3 years. I don't know what time is anymore. For Realm, which used to be called Stereobox. But they do a couple of really cool things. One is that they hire a team of writers. So I was the lead on this new one, Echo Park 2060, which is not out yet, but you can sign up to their website and see what they've already got out. And also they release everything in the form of audio podcasts. So everything's broken up into episodes. So you lengthwise it's about the same as an audiobook, but you get an episode at a time, kind of like a TV show. So it's sort of writing to a slightly different kind of structure, and also collaborating with everyone else on the team, which is usually 4 or 5 people. And that's been really cool. So you can go to Realm. If you search for my name there, I think you'll find the other series I've worked on, and one of my short stories that they bought the audio rights to. and that's my website, Curtis C. Chen. It's 3 C's. If you want to find out more about any of that. But yeah, what we're going to talk about today is query letters. And I did sell my first novel by sending a query letter to an agent, and then got an agent that way, and they took it to the publishers. So we can talk more in detail about that. I'm going to give sort of a more general overview here about, how do you do the query or the pitch, as some people will call it. And why do we have to do this? This is your first nightmare, by the way, this creepy monkey. So enjoy. But yeah, so a lot of people will ask why we have to do query letters, right? Why is this sort of the process that has evolved, and why do people insist on it, especially literary agents, when they could just, read the book because you've written all of it and you have a manuscript and it's finished and all that. So Allie Carter, who's a YA author, has written a book called Dear Allie, How Do You Write a Book? It's very meta, but it is nonfiction, and it's sort of full of all different kinds of writing advice. A lot of stuff about craft, but also some stuff about business. So if you actually want to get stuff published. And she has a chapter about querying, in which she sort of addresses some of the sort of normal, typical complaints that you might hear from people. And here are 3 of them that I'll just read real quick. So, for example, why do I need to tell them about my book? Why can't they just read it? If I could tell my story in a paragraph, I wouldn't have written a whole book. And I can't wait to get an agent so that I never have to summarize my book in 3 sentences ever again. That one's funny to me because you have to do this all the time. But Allie goes through this, so I definitely recommend this book because she has lots of great writing advice, and she also has interviewed a bunch of other authors. And so she sort of gives you comparisons about, how do you, how many words you write a day, or like what's your typical length, and all this other stuff. How did you get started? So it's a really good sort of survey of the field, especially the YA field. And it's written, as you can see, it's very direct, plain spoken language. But here's the important part from her chapter, and all credit to Allie Carter for this. But she talks about query letters, and she says they're very important, and they need to be professional but not pretentious, clear but not boring, clever but not cute. And at the top here, you see she says, she still, even though she is a best-selling author, she still has to summarize her books in a sentence or 2. And this is not just for writing query letters. I'm going to argue that, if you want to make a career out of being a writer, you're going to be working on different projects, and people will ask you about them, right? Not just your agent or your editor, people you meet out in the world. Your family will ask you what you're writing about, and I don't think they want to sit there for 15 minutes while you explain everything about your novel and your world and all the. No, they just want the couple sentences, and then we can move on with Thanksgiving dinner. Like that's all they want. So it's important, and I think you want to get people's interest but not lose it, and so that's where finding something succinct and finding a short and catchy way to describe your story. You obviously don't want to lie about anything, right? You want to tell them what it's actually about, but you want to figure out the best way to introduce it to them because they know nothing about it to begin with, right? And that can be very tricky, but this is what we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's part of a Twitter thread from screenwriter Robert Cargill, where he uses a good, I think this is a good way to think about what you're doing with your query or your pitch. So I'm going to use pitch as a shorthand for any kind of like short, anywhere from like a sentence to a couple paragraphs. A query letter is usually 2 to 3 paragraphs, 200 to 300 words. But as I said, when you're talking to someone in person, you're going to want like a much shorter pitch, like maybe just a sentence or 2 about what your story is. And I think this is a good way to think about it, is when you're telling someone, in here he's specifically talking about an elevator pitch, and the idea behind that is that it's short enough that you can tell someone when you're riding in an elevator with them from just one floor to the other, right? So pretty short and something you can tell to a total stranger and have them understand. And if it's their kind of thing, then they'll be interested to know more. And you can hand them your business card or whatever. But he's saying, when they sold a movie he wrote called Sinister, the elevator pitch was, those found footage horror movies? Well, this is a movie about the guy that finds the footage in the first place. And so a couple things I want to point out here, that that sounds really simple, but it probably took him a while to like get to that that really good short, succinct pitch. He probably had to go through a lot of different versions and try it out on different people, which is what I recommend you do with your query letter as well. But also it is sort of and he talks about this in the thread more, and there's a link down there if you want to look it up. It also sort of takes advantage of referencing things that people already know, and I'm going to talk about this a little later with comp titles. I have several slides on that. And so I think it can be useful to think of, if you're going to pitch your story or to, start writing the query, to think about if your story were a movie. And as he says here, like if you were trying to like tell your friend about this great movie you just saw and you want them to see it, what are you going to tell them about that movie that's going to get them interested? Get them to want to see it, but not spoil it for them, right? Because you want them to have, a similar good experience to the one you had when you saw the movie. And so part of that is, separating yourself from the work, right? You don't have to necessarily tell them everything about it. You just want to, pick a couple things that are going to be most interesting up front. And also you want to, tell it to them in a way that's going to make sense to them, right? So again, referencing things they already know, like telling them what genre it is, or sort of sparking off things that you have high confidence that the other person already knows about, right? So for example, if you're writing, I don't know, a spy novel, like you might reference James Bond, or you might reference John le Carré, and those are two sort of very different types of spy novels, right? But if your audience knows anything about sort of the spectrum of spy novels, they'll be able to sort of place it in like, oh, okay, so you're saying that your story is like James Bond, and they have an idea of what James Bond is, and so you're able to use that reference to tell them more information than the number of words you used, right? Like you can say 2 words, James Bond, and that sort of implies a lot of other stuff. Because that's a well-known character with a well-known history and sort of has its own sort of, tropes within that franchise. So when you say James Bond, people think of certain things, and you don't have to spend all those other words, right? You can just say those 2 words. Anyway, so I feel like if you have trouble starting out with a query or a pitch, you can try to think of it this way, like, okay, if this were a movie and I wanted my best friend to go see it, how would I describe it to them, without spoiling it, but also like short enough to keep their attention and like pointing out the things that I think they're going to find the most interesting. Okay. All right. So real quick on the query letter itself, there's a very specific format. When you get to, you're done with your novel, you've revised it, you've got a full manuscript, and it's ready for someone to look at. This is Carissa Taylor, who's another author in Australia, I believe, and she has a whole series about query letters on her blog, and you can go look it up. And she has a very simple, easy to follow template about how you write the query email. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but I will highlight the pitch here, or the hook. I will say that the 3 most important things here are the hook, the book, and the cook. And of those, the hook is the most important, the part in red here. So that's the pitch for your book, which is the meat of the query. And it's written in 3rd-person present tense. You should really, I recommend following that rule with very few exceptions. I have seen queries work in first person, for example, if it's a very specific voice and a very strong character in the story, but you really have to know what you're doing, and it's very tricky to get that right. What people are expecting to see, what agents are expecting to see, is a third person present tense. So that is something like, for example, this is not a well-written query, but in terms of the format, it's just like, so there's this dude called James Bond, and he goes to, let's say, Morocco, and he does this sort of thing. So it's sort of a natural way that you might speak to someone when you're telling a story, right? Like, oh, my cousin, James Bond, just went to Morocco, or in the present tense, my cousin James Bond, he goes to Morocco, and what do you know? He finds a monkey that looks like a chicken. I don't know what I'm talking about, but just as an example of the form, right? So for your novel, you might introduce a character and say, like, James Bond is a monkey collector who goes to Morocco to pick up a new monkey that looks like a chicken, which is really awesome. And go from there. But third person present tense is what they're expecting to see. And all this other stuff, it's fairly specific, but it's really easy to get right if you just kind of follow the template. And part of the reason for that is, you don't want, anything, you don't want too many things to distract them from your actual pitch, right? So if there's something weird in like the greeting or, the subject line, it's going to throw an agent off. You just want to, very directly let them know, like, this is a query letter and this is the story I'm telling. And not too much else, honestly, because that's the thing that they're really going to care about. Like, is this a story that they connect with, and that they think they would want to champion to publishers and try to sell for you. Okay, and you're going to be working together with this person in a business context, so you want to be professional and not too casual on the first introduction, which is generally the query letter. Okay. If you want to look at actual query letters that have been successful, again, this is Carissa Taylor's doing. She's put together a successful queries database, and that's the link at the bottom, but you can probably also just search for successful queries on the web and get this spreadsheet. The cool thing about this is that there's a lot of recent novels published in the last few years, a lot of authors you may know, a lot of books you may have read. So you can, if you've read a book, for example, Chilling Effect by Valerie Valdez, which I highly recommend, you can go read her original query letter, and then that'll give you an idea of, okay, I read the book, so I know this was the story. And then you look at the query letter, and you can see, what she's putting in there, what she's leaving out, what she is emphasizing to introduce someone to the story and to her characters and her world. Okay. And it's also broken down, as you can see, by genre, and you can look at which agent it was that represented an author. So the author wrote the query letter, and that was the agent who responded to that query letter. So you can kind of see what people have been doing recently in terms of like who's interested in what. This is something you will also get from the literary agency websites. They will generally all say, whether they're open to queries right now and what each particular agent is looking for in terms of genre. Like some people only want like adult novels. Some people only want YA or children's or very specific things. Some people don't like some people only do nonfiction or only do fiction, or they'll get more specific in genre. Or they might even say they would like to see a story of a particular type, right? They want to see stories about monkey collectors. Again, I just made that up. So there may be someone, I don't know. Mary Roach is probably writing that book right now. Anyway, okay, so all right, so I want to say a few words about comp titles, because this is something people talk about a lot, and that's short for comparison titles. By the way, this is your second author nightmare here. This is the movie What About Bob, which you can, it's an oldie, but you can find it streaming online somewhere, and it's sort of, I'm going to say sort of a horror suspense comedy thing. Bill Murray, Richard Dreyfuss. yeah. Anyway, comps. So comp titles. This is something that sometimes people feel strongly about. I'm going to argue it's going to really depend on what your story is. So I'll tell you for my query letter for the first Kangaroo novel, I didn't feel like I had good comp titles, so I just described it as a very specific genre. Like it was a funny science fiction spy thriller. I felt like that was specific enough that someone would know this is where it fits in the market, right? Some agents really like comp titles. Dongwon Song really likes them. This was another Twitter thread from a while ago where he was responding to something Sarah Guan, who was an editor at Orbit. She is at Erewhon now. She was talking about comp titles. And Dongwon has a good point here where, this is, he mentions that this is something that, editors and publishers will talk about sort of behind the scenes, away from you as the author, because you've already written the novel and it is what it is. But when they're buying it and they're thinking about, okay, how does this fit into our line of all the books we're publishing? How are we going to market this to people? And this is where comp titles can be really useful, again, as a sort of a shorthand, so you can say something in a few words that that packs a lot of meaning into it. That makes sense. Kind of like the James Bond thing, right? Like you can say James Bond, it applies a lot of other things. And if you have a good comp title, that can imply a lot of other things about your novel. But again, you want to make sure that it's accurate, that it gives someone the right idea about what your story is. Okay, so Dongwon has this very simple recommendation for, if you want to do comp titles, ideally you'll be able to find, 2 other books and say that your book is like A plus B, and therefore it's awesome, either for obvious reasons or you can like expound upon that. And this is going to be specific to your project, how well you can do this, whether there are good comp titles. And you might sort of people talk or pitch stories like this a lot, especially in Hollywood. Well, they'll say something is, where they'll reference past projects because they want people to think that their new thing is going to be as successful as this other thing was. But especially in publishing, I think it's important not to be too hyperbolic, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, so here's an example. So let's pick 2 books, Battle Royale and The Giver. So they might seem very different from each other. But this is the thing with comp titles. Like you might say, and I think in a lot of cases it is very useful to say, when you're comparing your book to another book, that your book has certain characteristics of another book, right? So, for example, your book may not be like Battle Royale in that it's about school children traveling on the island having to fight each other, but you may say that it has the sort of the graphic intensity and explicit violence of a Battle Royale. And if someone knows that book, then they know about that element of it, right? And similarly, if you're comparing to The Giver, like what part of The Giver are you comparing it to? Is it the sort of is it the setting? Is it the specific character? Is it the relationships between certain characters? And you can be very specific about that in your query. You can say it has, this element of this novel combined with this element from this other novel. So you're not comparing it to like the whole other book. You're saying like this specific thing. And you can even do this with like specific characters. But again, depending on your project, so you need to know your own work pretty well. In this case, if you combine Battle Royale and The Giver, you might get something like The Hunger Games. And I think that's a so the Battle Royale sort of conflict setup, right, with teenagers having to compete against each other and kill each other, and then The Giver in a dystopian setting where a lot of stuff is sort of hidden from the populace, sort of thing. So hopefully you can see how that works, and think about whether that whether you can find something that will work for your story. A quick warning here is that you do not want to say, even if your book is actually like Game of Thrones meets Harry Potter, like maybe it is set in like, a kingdom where there's a lot of conflict and there's a magic school in that kingdom and there are kids who have to deal with going to magic school, but also like the war that's happening. Maybe it does have those elements, but I'm going to say don't say that, because no one's going to believe you, right? Because the other thing you're trying to evoke is like if you say that, people are going to think you're going to say your book is so awesome that it's going to be as popular as Game of Thrones plus Harry Potter, and no one believes that. Like, both of those were very singular phenomena that are unlikely to happen again in the same way in publishing ever. So you want to find things that are very, very specific to what your story is. So one recommendation I've seen is if you can find books that were published in the last 5 years in your genre by mid-list authors. That will demonstrate that you have some understanding of the publishing market, as it stands right now. And if you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. The most important thing is find something that is, if you're going to use a comp title, find something that is very specific to your story and actually describes what it is in a way that's going to sort of invite the other person to want to learn more about it. So, for example, if you say it's like Flight of the Conchords meets The Office with vampires, that is obviously What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show. Maybe also a movie to some extent, but I'll agree. The TV show has sort of its own tone that is very specific. And again, The Office was very popular, but you're referencing a very specific thing there, right? It is a specific, in this case, it's a sort of a workplace comedy done in a fake documentary style. And What We Do in the Shadows, similarly, is done as a fake documentary. So with that sort of conceit in terms of how they're presenting the story. Okay. That is your next nightmare, by the way. Vampires who are the most annoying old people you've ever met. All right, so some more examples of this. Locust Magazine is specifically about genre publishing, so science fiction, fantasy, horror, all that good stuff. But every month they have a section on deals, so which authors have sold which books. This is from the April issue this year, but you can see that a lot of these deals will tell you, this author sold this book, and here's just a quick, very short description of it, right? So Meg Ellison sold #1 fan, Misery for Millennials. Again, it's taking advantage of a known quantity, which is Misery, the book or the movie. Probably the movie, because more people have seen that than read the book. Sorry, Stephen King. And for millennials. So right there, just 3 words, and I would argue they pack a lot of meaning into that and tell you that as a reader, that already tells you if you're interested in reading that story, right? Nan Fisher sold Some of It Was Real, about a reluctant psychic. And here the title is also doing some of the work, right? That particular title, when you know it's about a reluctant psychic, some of it was real, which parts weren't real? What are we talking about here? Again, if you're interested in that, I would argue you know already after that one line. And then Andrea Tang's YA The Kingdom of Without, a cyberpunk Six of Crows. Again, if you know either of those things and whether you like them, in this case, hell yeah, cyberpunk Six of Crows. Can I read this right now? Okay, so Locust is a great place to find out about that, and also other kinds of genre news if you're working in science fiction, fantasy, any kind of speculative fiction, really. All right, so specifically for query letters, there are places to find who you want to query, what agents are open, what they're looking for. Here's 3 different websites: Agent Query and Query Tracker. I believe you can use well, enough of their features for free to find agents. Publishers Marketplace, you do have to pay monthly for. I believe it's like $25 a month last time I checked. But they have, you know, they may have a sort of a much cleaner database just because they are offering it as a subscription service. So they're that is offered by Publishers Weekly, which is a trade magazine that covers a lot of different publishing news. So that is definitely reliable. And I've used all 3 of these in my own sort of agent search, so I can vouch for their utility. They all kind of take a little while to figure out how to use them because they are databases. So like, how do you search? How do you find the right things? How do you read the listings? And again, this is very different from writing the novel. So it is extra homework that you have to do, but as Lawrence Kasdan said, you're a writer, to paraphrase him. You're a writer, so doing homework every night is kind of what you signed up for. Sorry to tell you. Okay, Query Shark is another good resource for research. I use this a lot when it's figuring out like, what does a query letter actually look like, and how do you pitch the story in such a short 2 to 3 paragraphs, and like you have to leave out a lot. So what do you put in? What do you use to introduce this thing to someone totally new? And Query Shark is run by Janet Reed, who's also a literary agent. And basically the idea is people can send her their query letters that they're working on, and she will critique them. But she does it publicly on the blog. So you have to give her permission to say, yes, you can post my query letter, and then tear it apart and tell me what's wrong with it. And hopefully you will learn from that and go back and fix it. And so if you go to the blog, on the sidebar, you'll see she has links to a few different query letters where you can see the revision process, because they have sent her each version and she sort of helped them get to done. So I did also send my query letter to her back several years ago, but it's number 242 on Query Shark. You want to search for it. She did not critique it. She just said, this is great, which was a little weird for me because like I don't know if I learned anything here. But she actually did read my manuscript and gave me notes on it. I did not sign with her. I have a different agent. But she was very helpful, and she didn't have to do any of that. She also didn't have to send me the Kirkus review when the book came out. But she was she was very helpful, and I feel like I'm trying to always sort of pay it forward with these talks and helping other authors. And part of it is self-serving. I will admit, because I believe, like I haven't talked to him about this, but I believe part of the reason that a lot of these agents are on Twitter and they like dispense free advice on Twitter all the time. These are just a few people that I know, and I think they give really good tips. Sam Morgan is my agent. Ann Tibbetts is based in Southern California. She's also a writer, so she's had her own novels published at the same time that she's representing other people for their novels. And Kate McKeon is, I believe, the VP of Howard Moorhain, and she also has a newsletter that you can sign up for. And I believe, so this is my own belief, is that the self-serving part of this is that we want everyone to get better at not just writing, but thinking about your story and understanding what your story is and how to describe it to someone else and make it interesting. And I think none of us wants to have the 15-minute conversation in a bar where someone is telling you the whole backstory of their novel. Like we want to hear like 2 sentences, and they'll tell us if you're interested, and if we are, we'll ask more questions about it. and then that'll start the conversation, and that's really what you want. Another way to think about this that might be helpful is your query letter is kind of like you're going on a blind date with someone, right? And you want to introduce yourself. You don't want to lie about anything, but you kind of want to put your best foot forward, and you want to have an idea of of how you're going to sort of start this relationship. And again, it is a professional business relationship that you're going to have with your agent, but you're also going to be talking about your art and your creative work, and that can get very personal and intimate. So I think it's important to find the right person that you're going to be able to have all of those conversations with, right? Like ranging from like just talking about like what does this mean in the contract to what should I work on next. Yeah, and as I mentioned, Kate McKeon has a newsletter, and you don't even have to subscribe because the archives are online, and she has a whole 3-part series on how to write query letters. So you can find her. You can probably just search for Kate McKeon. The newsletter is called Agents and Books, and again, she's also on Twitter. And yeah. I will mention that. So Sam's tweet down here, the MSWL stands for Manuscript Wishlist, and you'll also see agents tweet about that sometimes. And some of them will have like a particular book that no one has written, but they would love to see this kind of fantasy novel or this kind of middle grade novel, and they'll have something very specific in mind. For example, you see Sam's here is Skins meets Harry Potter, which, as far as I know, no one has written that yet, although I'm attempting to now. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so that is all of my prepared material. Again, this is my website. You can look up my stuff there. And your final nightmare here is David S. Pumpkins. And I will now open it up. If you have questions, thank you for coming. Hopefully this has been a helpful overview. But we have time, so I'm happy to answer any more specific questions people might have about query letters, the querying process. Yeah. So let me stop the screen share, and yeah.
Hi, I'm always better verbally than I am in typing questions on my tiny iPhone. Is it okay if I ask a question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if people are comfortable, at least muting themselves. This is being recorded, but yeah, I do encourage people to do that, so that we can have sort
well,
of.
I'm Donna Anderson, and
Okay.
thank you for your time. Of course, I always appreciate published authors that give us struggling ones your time, and I understand that when you want to publish, mainstream publish, that you absolutely must have an agent, and they don't want to talk to you, any publishing house, without one. But I was also told that you absolutely must have an agent that is based in New York City. Do you believe that that is true?
So yeah, so that's a sort of a 2-part question. So I'll take the second part first. No, you do not need to have an agent based in New York City. It can help in some cases, but for example, Ann Tibbetts is based in Southern California.
Okay.
And I know there are a couple of other agencies in places like on the West Coast in California who are fairly, well established and successful. And most stuff happens online anyway, through email or over the phone. Like I did not meet my agent or my editor until like several years after we had done all the contracts and like gone through all the edits, and I didn't meet my editor until after like both of these books had actually been published, because he was in New York and I'm over here in the Portland area. So no, I do think it's important that you do your research and make sure that they are a reputable, like an actual legitimate literary agency. There's a resource on the SIFWA site called Writer Beware, where they have a list of agents that are known to be, either scammers or like just unscrupulous. They do kind of shady stuff because they've gotten complaints from authors. And you can also email beware@sfwa.org if you have a question. For example, if someone approaches you with an offer of either representation or they say they want to make your book into a movie or whatever, and you have never heard of them before and you can't find good information about them, you can always email Writer Beware, and they will have people submit reports to them confidentially, so they will have a lot more information that they publish, and they might be able to tell you more. The first part is that yes, generally the large publishers do require all submissions to come through an agent. There are some small presses that will accept submissions directly from writers. And those can be hard to find, but a lot of them are local. So, for example, here in Portland, there's Forest Avenue Press, which I think Christy mentioned, and Laura Stanfill is giving the keynote later today, I think. And then for nonfiction, there are places like Microcosm, and let me see, CamCat is in, I want to say, Tennessee. They've been doing a lot of real interesting stuff lately in genre. In Seattle, there's places like Aqueduct and Hydra House, and what you'll find with a lot of small presses is they'll be really tightly focused on a very specific thing. So I believe it's
yes, I've noticed that. Yeah.
So sometimes they will put out calls for specific things, like we're looking for novels that are like this. Stelliform Press is another one. So yeah, but generally, an agent's going to be helpful for more than just negotiating the contract and submitting stuff. They're going to be able to answer questions about the publishing industry and how it works, and things sort of outside of the strict contract terms that you might want to know about, in terms of how do you deal with your editor. And I certainly had a lot of questions for my agent when I started out, because I had not worked in publishing before, so I just didn't know a lot of stuff, and he was very patient in explaining all this stuff to me.
How may I ask you a personal question? How many query letters did you send out before you found an agent that you liked and wanted to work with?
It was quite a few. I'd have to go back and look at my spreadsheet, but I believe it's between 20 and 30, and
really
over the course of a year or more. And part of that was just finding the right person who was open to queries, and then sending something, and you have to wait for them to respond. And I was doing it in batches of like 5 or 6, just in case someone came back and said, like, this query is really confusing, I don't understand this part of it. Then I could rework it before sending it out to the next batch of agents.
Okay, so you didn't just blanket send them out. You actually chose a small group at a time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's going to be down to what you're comfortable with as a person who has to like track all this stuff yourself.
Right.
I know some people just sort of do everything all at once, so they'll send out 50 queries all at once, 50 separate emails, just to be clear, like one email
right,
and then just wait. But yeah, I chose a different process just from
that sounds very confusing for me. I think I prefer your route. Okay, thank you. I won't take up all of the time. I'll be quiet for now and let other people ask you questions.
Thank you, Donna. Do we
Hi,
have
Curtis.
other questions in the chat?
Yeah, we have a few more. Cheryl asked, is there a difference in presenting query letters for children's books?
So I'm not that familiar with the children's book market. I believe, so it depends on whether we're talking about like just prose books. I know at least one middle grade author, and I know she got her agent by querying a sort of the normal way. If we're talking about picture books, that's going to have a different process, because a lot of times they will want to know if you already have an artist that you're working with, because that's sort of the whole package that the publisher wants to know about.
I can actually pop in here and answer that one, because I do kids
Okay.
books. It is actually this almost exactly the same. And in fact, unless you are the author illustrator of a picture book, you would not actually be finding the illustrator. And so you would handle it the same way. I mean, basically what Curtis just presented in his presentation is exactly what SCBWI is, the local children's writers groups, and they have conferences every year too. And the advice that you just got from Curtis is the exact same advice you'd get from a query letter writing workshop at a place like SCBWI. So it's very similar. The only time that it would be different is if you are interested in doing work for hire, which is a whole different animal in and of itself, and that's a whole different workshop. But if you're going into traditional publishing and trade market publishing, which is what we're talking about here, then the query letter project process for kids stuff is virtually identical. The only time that it would be different is if you are actually the illustrator as well of a picture book. You might be also including dummies, but other than that, you're the process of trying to distill your book into the elevator pitch is the exact same process for kids books as it is for adults. So
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you, Christy.
You're welcome. Let's see. Kelsey asked if there are agents and editors who do not like comps, and is there an easy way to tell?
I'm sure there are. I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker, unless, as I said, like you choose a really bad comp in that it's inaccurate, or doesn't describe your book well. Some people will tell you if they like to see comps. So like I said, it's going to be a lot of homework researching agents, and there's generally they're going to have something official like a bio on their agency's website. And that's where they'll probably tell you like what kinds of things they're interested in seeing right now, and whether they're open to queries. But you can also see if they're on Twitter, for example, or if they have a personal blog, or if they've done interviews with other people's writing websites or podcasts. Sometimes agents will go on just to talk about writing and publishing. And so there, potentially you can find out a lot more about not just what they're sort of officially looking for, but what their personal taste is and what kinds of things they like. I would caution people not to necessarily like tailor your query to one specific agent, because you don't want to do that for 30 query letters. Honestly, like you want to figure out what is it that's going to be the most interesting way to introduce your story, and then put it out there, and you kind of do just have to work through. You gotta kiss a lot of frogs, right, before you find the right person that connects with that story, and then beyond that, like you're gonna that's gonna start the conversation, but you're gonna trade emails. You might get on the phone with them, and you're gonna talk, and you're gonna have to decide, like, is this a person that I feel like I'm going to be able to work with, and that I'm going to want to work with long term. For ideally you're going to have the same agent for several years, so they can also help you manage your career. And like Christy mentioned, like work for hire can be kind of tricky, but an agent will, like my agent has sort of brought things to me and said like, hey, would you be interested in doing this kind of thing that this company is offering? And they can help you sort of negotiate a lot of that stuff, and some of the stuff that you as the writer would never even hear about. So yeah, you do have to establish that relationship. Sorry, hopefully that answered the question.
No, yeah, I think so. And I was actually just going to say, like you had talked about writing many queries to many agents before you found your agent. And I would just remind people that the absolute surest way to get a rejection is to not read the instructions on their website first. Yep. So even though you're having to like streamline the process because you're sending it to a lot of people, you want to make sure that you're not sending your, sci-fi fantasy novel to somebody that only reps contemporary fiction or whatever. Like you want to make sure that the people you're sending it to are actually people who would be interested in what you're writing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will mention one other thing, which is like everyone's going to have different guidelines, and it can seem very annoying, but I feel like that's sort of the first step in demonstrating that you're going to be a good person to work with if you respect their time and respect what they're asking for. So I've seen a lot of different things. So some agents, like, they only want your query as an email. Some people want the query plus like the first chapter or the first 3 chapters or the first 50 pages. Some people want that as an attachment. Some people want that as an attachment only as a Word document. Some people don't want the attachment. They want you to copy and paste it as plain text into the email. Some people have a form on their website where you have to fill out the form with all the right fields. And it can, as I said, seem a little annoying to like do this for 20 people, and it's different every time. But I would argue that if you want a career as a writer, it's also good practice, because you're going to have to read instructions and follow instructions. And as I said, respect other people's time, because this agent is not just working with you. They have a bunch of other clients. When you work with an editor, they have a bunch of other authors they're working with. When you work with anyone at the publishing house, like the copy editor or the cover artist, they have a bunch of other projects they're working on. So you gotta you gotta be professional and find the best way to find the people that are going to want to work with you in the way that you want and that they want.
So the last question I have here is, I think probably anybody who's a writer has probably dealt with this. Do you have any advice for how to get over myself, and in parentheses, anxiety, imposter syndrome, etc., and take the first step of sending a query? And I think we've probably all been there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean,
you have to do that. You just have to do it.
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, the first thing that occurred to me was to say, like, are you in therapy? I recommend that for anyone, honestly, at this point. But have you considered not writing? Maybe that would help. No, but yeah, I agree that it is. I certainly had a lot of anxiety myself when I came to the point of writing the query letter, because it's very, very different than writing a novel, and it's always scary to put yourself out there, right? And to make yourself vulnerable, and
right.
You're kind of asking people to reject you, right? Because
yeah.
that is definitely what is going to happen most of the time, and that is something you just have to accept, especially as a writer. Like I also write a lot of short fiction, and with short fiction, it's even worse than querying, because with querying, at least you can send you can write the query letter and then send it to a bunch of agents all at the same time, and they understand that that's the process, right? And you may have to wait for each one to respond to you for weeks or months, but at least it's out there and a bunch of people are potentially looking at it. With short fiction, most markets don't allow simultaneous submissions, so you're going to send it to one magazine, wait like 3 months for them to reject you, send it to another one, wait like another 2 months, and it can be years, honestly. Like, I've had stories out there for years and years before they got accepted for publication. Some are still out there and they haven't been accepted yet. And it's just kind of the way things work right now. And again, it's you have to respect other people's time and respect what their process is. if you want to work with them. Obviously now you can, do indie publishing and put stuff out yourself on your website or as an ebook through Amazon or other places, but you're still dealing with the same difficulties of finding the audience, and that's something that an agent and a publisher will help you with, is figure out like who's going to be interested in this book and how do we reach them, and they can help you a lot with the marketing of it. But yeah, I would say it's for querying specifically. You're going to have to start somewhere. So similar to writing a novel, right? You're going to have to start somewhere. The first draft is probably not going to be very good, but at least it's short, right? It's only like 300 words, so you can get that done in a finite amount of time. Whereas a novel, maybe you never know when you're going to finish, or it takes a much longer time. And I definitely recommend getting other people to look at it and to tell you if it makes sense, if it sounds interesting. For a lot of like I've looked at some other people's query letters in the past, and especially for speculative fiction like science fiction and fantasy, when there's often a lot of world building, right? You're setting something in the future or in a fantasy world, and you might feel like you have to explain a lot of stuff up front, and you may not have to explain that much. I think two things that can really help are, one, what I mentioned before, like referencing things that people are going to know, right? So, and that can, that's not necessarily, finding, comp titles, or, can you compare it to, James Bond or Sherlock Holmes or another well-known fictional character, Jane Austen or whatever. It's choosing very specific words and phrases that are going to convey not just sort of the basic information about, this is a fantasy world with magic, but to convey the tone of what your specific story is, right? Because even within fantasy worlds with magic, there can be a wide variation, right? Like, is this Lord of the Rings, or is this Terry Pratchett's Discworld, or is this something very grimdark, like I think it's Joe Abercrombie's Half a King sort of thing, right? Like there's all these things, and you don't even have to reference specific works, right? You can say, is this like a bright and cheerful kingdom, or is this a kingdom that is sort of nearly bankrupt, or is beset by monsters, or whatever, right? And it can be kind of tricky to choose the right words that are going to express all that in a very small amount of space. The other thing I would mention is that hello kitty. I don't think you can ever go wrong by focusing the query around your main character, whoever that is. And again, this can be tricky if you have like multiple main characters and multiple storylines, that sort of thing. But I feel like you can always choose, where does the book start? Who's the first person you meet? Who's the first protagonist that you're going to, follow through the whole story? And just talk about them, right? And so I think a lot of the successful queries that you'll see, certainly that I've seen, will start with just, the character's name. So like, again, to go back to my ludicrous example, like James Bond is a rare monkey collector, right? And so so that can get you a lot right up front, right? Like, what is the name? Does the name tell you anything, right? The fact that they're James Bond, they're not Jim Bond or Jimmy Bond, or they're not like Horace Bond, or like or Guillermo Bond, right? Like, just the name can tell you a lot already. And then sort of laying out like what that character is dealing with is going to tell you a lot about their world. And again, choosing the right words to describe it, break out the thesaurus and figure out like, okay, so so they're a down on their luck monkey collector. But is there a better word than down on their luck? Is he nearly bankrupt, or is he bad at his job? Is he secretly a monkey himself? How would you describe that? And so a lot of it, I think, is about sort of packing a lot of information into a small space. And that can be really tricky because you're going to have to go through a lot of different versions, have people read it. What does this tell you about the story? What do you think the story is going to be like? And I feel like that can almost be toward the end of refining the query, is getting the tone and the voice just right. Because you want to tell people what the story is, but you also want to give them sort of a feeling of this is what it's going to be like when you're actually reading the book. And you want that to be accurate. So they read the query, they're like, oh, I'm into this. And they read the manuscript, and they're like, yes, this is what I was hoping it would be. You don't want it to be the case where you query something, and they're like, oh, yeah, this sounds great. And they get the manuscript, and they're like, this is not what I was promised at all. I feel like that is almost kind of the worst case, even worse than rejection, is you get past that first step, and then someone sees that maybe you weren't lying about something, but it's just you were not doing a good enough job of giving them a feel of the manuscript. And that, again, that still may not be a deal breaker, right? The agent is still interested in the story, but then they're going to have a long conversation with you about okay, you thought your story was this thing, but I feel like it's actually this other thing. So do you agree with that, or are we going to have to talk about rewrites, or but again, you've started the conversation, and if the agent still likes the story enough, they're going to want to continue working with you and see if they can get to a point where you're both happy with a thing that you can take to a publisher.
I'm going to jump in because we are a little bit over. Cheryl asked about simultaneous submissions, and since we're about 5 minutes past, I will just say something really quick, and Curtis, you can say yes or no. Usually, Cheryl, you want to follow the instructions again. Typically, I believe agent submissions can be simultaneous. Sometimes when you're submitting a manuscript to a publisher, they have very specific guidelines upon that. So you just want to be checking in on that, making sure that you're following the instructions. Thank you so much, Curtis, for being here today. We really appreciate it. And if you have questions saved up about prepping manuscripts for submissions, including query letters, we are in about 10 minutes. We're going to have a panel with some authors about submitting. And so we're going to kind of take what we talked about here and then jump into a format where we can kind of have more back and forth conversation. So if you want to hop over to that in a few minutes, we'd love to have you. But thank you again, Curtis, for being here, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all.